The power of a single word can shift the foundation of political discourse, redirect the attention of a nation, and reshape the boundaries of acceptable conduct in public life. That word is treason. In the third decade of the 21st century, the use of such a term by a political leader in the United States is no longer a rare or shocking event. But when the former President of the United States, a man still commanding the loyalty of tens of millions, accuses one of his predecessors of treason, the gravity is difficult to dismiss. The statement carries consequences not only for domestic stability, but also for how democratic institutions are perceived abroad. In recent days, former President Donald Trump stood before cameras and microphones and declared that his predecessor, former President Barack Obama, was, in his words, guilty of treason. He did not qualify the accusation as speculative. He did not offer it as a rhetorical flourish. He stated it as fact. It is not a question, he said. He is guilty. This was treason. Such a claim, regardless of its veracity or motive, compels attention. The charge of treason is not merely a political insult. Under United States law, it is a capital offense. To assert that a former commander-in-chief has committed treason is to escalate the political stakes to their highest conceivable level. In a period where language has become a battlefield, and truth is often defined not by consensus, but by conviction, the weaponization of treason has deep implications. It is a signal, a rallying cry, and in some cases, a veiled provocation, not just to political opponents, but to the institutions designed to hold the republic together. Trump's remarks did not occur in a vacuum. They followed a statement by Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democratic congresswoman and current political ally of Trump, who claimed that Obama-era officials engaged in what she described as a seditious conspiracy. According to her account, they allegedly concealed evidence that Russia had not interfered in the 2016 election. The claim is not supported by any documented intelligence consensus. In fact, the opposite is true. A review conducted by the Senate Intelligence Committee, chaired at the time by Republican Senator Marco Rubio, affirmed in a bipartisan report that Russia did indeed mount an influence campaign during the 2016 election cycle. That campaign was designed to harm Hillary Clinton's presidential bid, assist Donald Trump, and undermine confidence in the United States electoral process. These conclusions were not presented lightly, nor were they the result of partisan manipulation. They were the product of years of investigation, multiple briefings, and testimony from intelligence officials under both Republican and Democratic administrations. They were supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the National Security Agency, and reaffirmed under leadership that included Trump's own appointees. But narratives are no longer bound by institutional validation. Today, political utility often takes precedence over evidentiary rigor. The statement made by Trump in the Oval Office, amplified by political allies and sympathetic media, represents more than just a personal grievance. It is an act of narrative reconfiguration. It seeks to recast the history of 2016, not as a chapter in electoral interference, but as a criminal plot against him. The implications of such a shift are profound. If accepted, the revised version reframes the entire premise of Russian interference, not as an act of foreign aggression, but as an excuse fabricated by domestic enemies. Under this interpretation, the intelligence community becomes complicit, law enforcement becomes partisan, and former presidents become criminals. And when the leader of a major political movement articulates such views without evidence and without opposition from his party's senior leadership, the narrative, however baseless, begins to acquire legitimacy in the factus of baseless, minds of millions. That legitimacy becomes a political weapon and, in certain cases, a justification for action. Trump's statements also drew a rare public response from the office of former President Obama. In carefully chosen language, The office rebuked the accusation as outrageous and ridiculous, describing it as a transparent attempt at distraction. While avoiding personal attacks, the response emphasized the continued consensus that Russia had indeed attempted to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. It reiterated the position that, while there had been no evidence of tampering with vote tallies or ballot machines, the broader effort to manipulate public opinion had been both real and coordinated. President Obama himself, in a press conference dated December 16, 2016, stated clearly that votes had been cast and counted appropriately, and that there was no evidence of compromised machines. His assurance was not that there had been no interference, but that the vote-counting process remained intact. These nuances, however, are often lost in the high-velocity information environment of 2025. Political discourse has been compressed into viral soundbites, algorithmic filters, and pre-existing ideological silos. In that environment, the distinction between an influence campaign and vote manipulation becomes blurred, and it is within that blur that accusations of treason gain traction. Tulsi Gabbard, in a separate media appearance, repeated the argument that the outrage over Russian interference was exaggerated. She did not deny the attempts at influence, but questioned the motivation behind the focus, suggesting that such coverage served a geopolitical narrative that no longer aligned with strategic reality. Her position, like Trump's, reflects a broader effort to redefine the events of 2016, not through forensic analysis, but through retrospective reinterpretation. It is a trend not confined to the United States. Across democracies, the past is increasingly contested territory, with rival factions seeking to rewrite history to suit present-day objectives. And so, the question becomes not whether the accusation is true, but why it is being made, and what outcome it is designed to produce. Trump's assertion that his predecessor committed treason is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader strategic pattern, one in which political rivals are cast not merely as opponents, but as enemies of the state. In this framework, institutional checks become obstacles, truth becomes negotiable, and loyalty is measured, not by adherence to law, but by allegiance to a singular leader. What unfolds next is not simply a media skirmish or a partisan distraction, but a test. A test of whether the architecture of constitutional governance, legal accountability, and civil discourse can withstand the sustained pressure of disinformation wielded as a weapon of political survival. The stakes are not limited to reputational damage or media cycles. When treason becomes a tool of campaign rhetoric, it creates the conditions for something far more destabilizing. It creates precedent. The precedent being set is not new, but the scale and visibility of its application is unprecedented in the American context. Throughout history, regimes have invoked accusations of treason to delegitimize opponents, consolidate power, and suppress dissent. From monarchies to military juntas, from revolutionary governments to authoritarian populists, the language of betrayal has always served as a blunt political instrument. What distinguishes democracies, at least in theory, is their restraint in wielding that instrument. The American Republic, founded in the crucible of rebellion, codified treason in narrow terms. Article 3 of the United States Constitution defines it with precise limitations, requiring overt acts and the testimony of two witnesses. It was not designed to be flexible. It was designed to be constrained. Yet, in recent years, the rhetorical threshold has lowered. The term has been invoked against military officers, legislators, journalists, and now, former presidents. Each use corrodes the boundary between lawful disagreement and existential threat. Each use expands the category of the enemy within. Trump's invocation of treason, specifically against Barack Obama, carries an additional geopolitical dimension. Obama is not simply a political figure. He remains a global symbol of American liberal democracy, a former president viewed by allies and adversaries alike as representative of the pre-2016 order. To accuse him of capital crimes is to send a signal not only to domestic audiences, but to foreign governments watching the trajectory of American self-governance. China, Russia, Iran, and other strategic competitors monitor such internal narratives carefully. They study the erosion of political norms as a metric of systemic vulnerability. When political leaders cast doubt on their own predecessors, when legal threats are used against former heads of state, the appearance of institutional instability becomes a geopolitical fact. It is exploited diplomatically and echoed in state-run media across capitals that benefit from a weakened American brand. In Moscow, coverage of Trump's comments about Obama has not been critical. Russian outlets have highlighted the allegations as evidence of chaos in the American political system. Kremlin analysts have used the controversy to reinforce their long-standing narrative that Western democracies are hypocritical and internally incoherent. For them, the accusation of treason from one president to another is a propaganda gift. In Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party has likewise observed the fragmentation with interest. As the United States attempts to rally coalitions against Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, narratives of American decline are welcomed and disseminated. The more divided the American political elite appears, the easier it becomes for Beijing to argue that Washington's global leadership is hollow. This is not accidental. Geopolitical rivals thrive in the space between perception and reality. And when American leaders offer ammunition in the form of unsubstantiated claims, that space widens. Domestically, the implications are equally consequential. The Department of Justice, the judiciary, and the national security apparatus are now caught between two imperatives. On one hand, they must respond to public discourse infused with legal accusations. On the other, they must uphold evidentiary standards that cannot be bent to political will. This tension, if pushed to its limit, produces institutional paralysis. If a former president is accused of treason by another, there is pressure to investigate. But when the claim is unsupported by evidence, to investigate too aggressively risks validating a political fiction. To ignore it entirely risks appearing selective or dismissive. It is a strategic dilemma, one that adversaries are quick to notice and exploit. Meanwhile, within the Republican Party itself, there has been little coordinated response. Some senior figures have remained silent. Others, including those who once validated the original findings of Russian interference, have now aligned themselves with Trump's narrative. Marco Rubio, whose Senate report in 2020 affirmed the reality of Moscow's electoral manipulation, now serves in Trump's cabinet. His prior conclusions remain a matter of public record, but his current silence speaks to the consolidation of loyalty over consistency. Tulsi Gabbard, too, presents a case study in realignment. Once a Democratic insurgent critical of both parties, she has now re-emerged as a vocal defender of Trump, challenging mainstream intelligence findings and promoting alternative theories about election interference. Her trajectory illustrates a broader shift, one in which allegiance to a leader can override prior ideological frameworks. This inversion of reality, in which established facts are reinterpreted or dismissed based on political expediency, is not without consequence. It fosters a culture in which truth is malleable, in which the line between dissent and betrayal is no longer defined by law, but by narrative. And narratives, unlike laws, do not require proof. They require repetition. That repetition is now visible in media echo chambers, social platforms, and partisan messaging. What begins as a fringe theory gains legitimacy through volume. And once internalized, it shapes behavior not just in digital spaces, but in the real world. The events of January 6, 2021, demonstrated the capacity of such narratives to translate into physical violence. The idea that the election had been stolen, that constitutional order had been subverted, led to a direct assault on the seat of American legislative power. That moment, driven by rhetoric, served as a case study in the cost of unbounded political language. Today, the charge of treason carries the same latent volatility. When directed at a former president, it creates a target. It invites not just legal debate, but emotional reaction. And in a political culture increasingly animated by anger, such reactions are not hypothetical. They are operational. That is the danger, and that is why the current moment cannot be dismissed as theatrics or distraction. It is part of a broader pattern, a strategic campaign to redefine the boundaries of acceptable truth and to recast political rivalry as existential confrontation. In this climate, no fact is settled, no past is beyond revision, and no individual, however decorated, is immune from criminal insinuation. The accusation of treason against Barack Obama is only the latest manifestation, but it is unlikely to be the last. When a former president accuses his predecessor of treason, it is not only a matter of political rivalry, it becomes a matter of institutional stress. That stress radiates outward, touching not only the executive branch, but also the intelligence community, the judiciary, and the legislative core of the republic. To understand the depth of this stress, it is necessary to return to the original assessments surrounding the 2016 election. The consensus across the intelligence community, affirmed in both public and classified findings, was that the Russian Federation orchestrated an influence campaign targeting the U.S. electoral process. The primary objective was to weaken public faith in democratic institutions, delegitimize the expected Clinton administration, and support the candidacy of Donald Trump. These conclusions were not speculative. They were based on digital forensics, intercepted communications, and corroborating evidence collected over years. Multiple agencies, operating independently, reached the same outcome. The Senate Intelligence Committee, led by then-Chairman Marco Rubio, validated these assessments in a comprehensive report published in 2020. The committee's findings left little ambiguity. Russia's campaign, it stated, aimed to damage the Clinton campaign and help Trump while undermining confidence in American democracy. This report was not partisan. It passed with bipartisan approval, including unanimous votes on critical sections. The significance of that consensus, in an otherwise polarized legislative body, underscored the credibility of the evidence. But in 2025, these findings are no longer at the center of public debate. Instead, the debate itself has been reframed. The question is no longer whether foreign interference occurred, but whether the response to it was itself a crime. That inversion, that reframing of reality, is strategic. By asserting that Obama officials engaged in a cover-up, or worse, a conspiracy, Trump and his allies are not merely challenging the integrity of the past, they are preemptively discrediting future investigations. Any renewed scrutiny into Trump's conduct, any legal proceeding connected to ongoing inquiries, can now be cast as retaliation, as the continuation of a supposed political war. This is the logic of narrative warfare. By redefining victimhood, Trump positions himself not as the subject of scrutiny, but as the target of persecution. And in this framing, any institutional action taken against him becomes further proof of the conspiracy. Tulsi Gabbard's emergence as a key amplifier of this narrative is not incidental. Her former status as a Democratic lawmaker provides a perceived bipartisan veneer. Her media appearances, including recent statements on popular platforms, reinforce the idea that insiders have turned against the establishment and that revelations are only now beginning to surface. But the substance of her claims does not align with prior records. When she suggests that the Obama administration fabricated or suppressed evidence, she departs from her own previously stated views. She echoes, almost verbatim, The reassurances offered by President Obama in late 2016 that no vote tampering had occurred. The issue, then and now, was influence operations, not vote manipulation. The distinction, however, is increasingly obscured. Political discourse has grown hostile to nuance. In the echo chamber of tribal media, influence becomes interference. Interference becomes fraud, and fraud becomes treason. Each term escalates the stakes without necessarily increasing the evidence. This escalation is not without risk. The invocation of capital crimes against political rivals invites radical interpretation. Among a small but significant minority of politically motivated actors, language becomes action. History offers numerous examples of how rhetoric, once normalized, leads to physical violence. This is not theoretical. It is observable. The riot on January 6th did not emerge in a vacuum. It followed weeks of statements alleging stolen elections, deep state conspiracies, and traitorous officials. These narratives, once confined to fringe forums, became normalized through constant repetition by political figures, media outlets, and social media influencers. That normalization created a permission structure. It allowed individuals to justify extraordinary behavior as defense of the republic. It reframed illegal acts as patriotic resistance. Today, the accusation of treason against Barack Obama follows a similar trajectory. It is introduced without evidence, repeated without challenge, and consumed without question. And while it may not result in immediate physical consequences, it further corrodes the foundation of shared political reality. That corrosion is the strategic goal. By undermining the legitimacy of former presidents, by discrediting bipartisan investigations, and by conflating political opposition with betrayal, a new paradigm is created. In that paradigm, there are no longer neutral institutions. There are only allies and enemies. And in such a paradigm, justice is not about law, but about loyalty. That is the underlying logic of the current campaign. It is not aimed at persuading a majority, but at mobilizing a base that already believes in systemic betrayal, that views the intelligence community with suspicion, and that sees in Trump not merely a political figure, but a symbol of retribution. Retribution politics does not require factual grounding. It requires grievance, and grievances, when reinforced and weaponized, become ideological anchors. Once accepted, they are difficult to dislodge. This is why no court ruling, no official report, no bipartisan consensus will necessarily reverse the effect of Trump's accusation. The aim is not to convince a court of law, but to convince a constituency. And in that regard, the charge of treason serves its purpose. But as the language becomes more extreme, so too do the expectations. When a former president is labeled a traitor, some followers will demand action. If no action is taken, if no indictment follows, disillusionment can set in, and that disillusionment, in turn, can fuel conspiracy theories even more elaborate than the original claim. The political system becomes locked in a cycle of accusation, disappointment, and radicalization. Each unprosecuted charge becomes evidence of a deeper cover-up. Each denial becomes proof of corruption. And thus, the system consumes itself. In this environment, the actual threat is not Barack Obama, nor is it Donald Trump. The threat is the normalization of treason as political rhetoric. Once that threshold is crossed, it cannot be easily uncrossed. In the long history of the American Republic, the deliberate targeting of political opponents through accusations of treason has remained largely symbolic. The Founding Fathers, mindful of the abuses of power they witnessed under monarchy, embedded constitutional safeguards to prevent the criminalization of dissent. But those safeguards depend on political restraint. Once political leaders begin to erode the distinction between opposition and betrayal, once they treat electoral loss as sabotage and governance as warfare, those safeguards become vulnerable to collapse. They exist on paper, but are no longer operative in practice. The use of treason charges by Donald Trump must therefore be examined not only as a rhetorical choice, but as a systemic stress test. What it tests is whether institutional actors will respond in accordance with law or in deference to political pressure. The Department of Justice, the last firewall in many of these disputes, finds itself in an unenviable position. If it ignores the accusation, it risks being portrayed as indifferent or complicit. If it responds, it risks legitimizing a baseless claim and lending credibility to a conspiracy narrative with no foundation in fact. The result is paralysis. Trump's critics, including former officials from his own administration, have warned of the dangers in this tactic. One such voice is Miles Taylor, a former Department of Homeland Security Chief of Staff. He has characterized the repeated invocation of treason as a destabilizing force, one that could provoke real-world violence if left unchecked. Taylor is not speaking in hypotheticals. He, like others who have been targeted with similar accusations, has experienced threats, harassment, and attempts at intimidation. His warning is not abstract. It is grounded in lived reality. Other figures, including former Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, and former Federal Bureau of Investigation agents Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, have all been labeled by Trump as traitors at one point or another. The common denominator is clear. They either opposed, questioned, or investigated the actions of the former president. Their punishment, in rhetorical terms, was severe, and the underlying message was unambiguous. Disagreement with Trump could result in public condemnation as an enemy of the state. The chilling effect is calculable. Officials who once felt duty-bound to speak out now weigh the personal costs. They consider the risk of retaliation, the media scrutiny, the potential for legal harassment, and the impact on their families. Silence becomes the path of least resistance. And yet, silence is not neutrality. In an environment where treason is invoked casually, silence creates a vacuum, one that can be filled with more radical interpretations. As the public narrative hardens, institutional voices must decide whether to engage or retreat. This question is no longer theoretical. It is operational. When Trump accuses Barack Obama of treason, he is not just attacking a predecessor. He is testing the response of the system. He is watching, measuring, and waiting, not for legal vindication, but for political effect. If the accusation is ignored, it signals impunity. If it is embraced by supporters, it signals power. And if it provokes a violent reaction, it will be dismissed as unrelated, disconnected, the work of isolated individuals acting alone. But as history shows, language matters. Political violence rarely emerges from silence. It emerges from cues, from signals, from coded permissions. Leaders may not issue explicit orders. They may not ask for violence directly. But their rhetoric, their accusations, their relentless invocations of betrayal all create an atmosphere in which action feels justified. That atmosphere, once created, is difficult to contain. This is the structural danger embedded in Trump's statement. It is not the likelihood that Barack Obama will be prosecuted. That remains improbable. What matters is the legitimization of prosecution as a political expectation. Once supporters believe that criminal action must follow, the failure to deliver it becomes a grievance of its own. It sets the stage for the next narrative, the next accusation, the next cycle of outrage. It is already visible in the digital ecosystem. Posts accusing Obama of treason have proliferated. Videos speculating about covert operations, secret indictments, and hidden trials have amassed millions of views. The line between political fantasy and perceived reality continues to blur. That blur is not an accident. It is a strategic space one in which facts become negotiable and loyalty becomes currency. In that space, institutions are no longer arbiters of truth. They are obstacles to overcome. It is in this strategic landscape that the Epstein file narrative re-enters. Trump's recent efforts to shift focus toward Barack Obama have coincided with renewed scrutiny over the Jeffrey Epstein case. His promise to release unredacted Epstein files has not materialized as expected. The backlash, even from segments of his own base, has been sharp. In this context, the accusation against Obama functions as a diversionary mechanism. Diversion in politics is not unusual, but diversion at this scale, invoking treason against a former president, is a measure of desperation. It reflects an environment in which conventional tactics are no longer sufficient and only escalation remains. That escalation, even if rhetorical, carries structural costs. It degrades public trust, it undermines legal standards, and it pushes the political system closer to normalization of crisis. In such a system, truth becomes fragmented. The public, overwhelmed by contradictory narratives, retreats into tribal allegiances. The idea of a shared reality becomes obsolete. And that, more than any single statement, is the true legacy of the accusation. In a functioning democracy, accusations of serious crimes, particularly those carrying the weight of treason, are expected to follow a defined legal process. There is investigation, evidence, indictment, and judicial review. Each step is governed by procedural safeguards intended to insulate the system from political manipulation. But when allegations are made without evidence, outside any legal channel, and amplified purely through media repetition, they do not function as part of the justice system. They function as propaganda. That distinction is critical. In recent years, political communication in the United States has become increasingly untethered from legal mechanisms. The courtroom has been replaced by the studio. The indictment has been replaced by the headline. The burden of proof, no longer relevant, gives way to the force of repetition. In this new paradigm, a claim does not need to be substantiated to be effective. It needs only to be believed. This dynamic is not limited to domestic politics. It has implications for foreign policy, intelligence partnerships, and alliance cohesion. When the United States projects instability from within, allies grow cautious. Intelligence sharing protocols become slower. Diplomatic coordination becomes more difficult. Military partnerships, reliant on trust at the highest levels, suffer from the erosion of credibility. European partners, many of whom worked closely with the United States during the 2016 investigations into Russian interference, have expressed quiet concern. For them, the politicization of intelligence findings, the public discrediting of national security officials, and the casual use of accusations such as treason are signs of internal decline. For adversaries, the picture is different. Strategic competitors see opportunity. In Beijing, officials interpret America's political fragmentation as evidence that its global leadership is in retreat. The United States, in their assessment, is consumed by its own internal contradictions. Its foreign policy is increasingly reactive, not proactive. Its alliances more performative than strategic. In Moscow, the narrative has already been operationalized. Russian disinformation campaigns have long relied on amplifying divisive rhetoric from within the United States. The accusation of treason against Obama, particularly when it is echoed by prominent domestic figures, becomes another data point in their broader narrative of Western collapse. Kremlin-linked media outlets are already framing the situation as proof that the United States is descending into authoritarian infighting, a republic turning against itself. This message is not designed for Americans. It is designed for Africa, for Latin America, for Southeast Asia. It is intended to challenge the legitimacy of U.S. influence in the global South, where Washington competes with Moscow and Beijing for political and economic alignment. The strategic cost, therefore, is not abstract. It is real. Every internal fracture, every unchallenged conspiracy, every reckless invocation of treason becomes a tool in the hands of America's adversaries. And unlike conventional weapons, narrative weapons cannot be intercepted. Internally, the domestic political system remains trapped in a loop. Former officials warn of escalation. Lawmakers attempt to navigate between outrage and exhaustion. And the public, confronted with an endless stream of contradictions, increasingly retreats into cynicism. This cycle is familiar. It is not unique to the Trump era, but it has been accelerated. What once occurred over the span of years now unfolds in days. A statement is made, the media reacts, institutions respond, and within a single news cycle, a new accusation is introduced. This velocity creates what strategists refer to as narrative saturation. The public becomes overwhelmed. Facts lose salience. Truth becomes subordinate to belief. And into that environment, further escalation is introduced. In the case of Trump's accusation against Obama, the escalation is twofold. First, it reframes the entire Russia investigation as an illegitimate conspiracy. Second, it positions Trump as the rightful victim of that conspiracy, thereby justifying any future action taken in his defense. This logic is recursive. It explains past failures, excuses present behavior, and authorizes future escalation. It is also not limited to verbal accusation. Trump has already hinted at the potential for criminal action. His allies in media and politics have echoed this theme. Some have demanded that Obama be prosecuted. Others have implied that more dramatic responses may be justified if the truth does not prevail. This rhetoric carries consequences. When a significant portion of the population comes to believe that former leaders are traitors and that justice has been denied, the probability of lone actor violence increases. It does not require direct orders. It requires only the perception that action is righteous and necessary. This is the same perceptual environment that preceded the attack on the Capitol in January of 2021. At that time, Trump's narrative of a stolen election was amplified relentlessly. The failure of legal avenues to produce the desired outcome became, for many, evidence of a deeper betrayal, and so, violence became rationalized. The question now is whether the treason narrative surrounding Obama follows a similar arc. If history is any guide, the pattern has already begun. There is accusation, amplification, escalation, and eventual normalization. And once normalized, the next accusation becomes easier. The danger is not confined to the individuals named. Today, it is Barack Obama. Tomorrow, it may be federal judges, prosecutors, journalists, or sitting members of Congress. The logic of treason, once untethered from legal definition, becomes a tool of convenience. It delegitimizes institutions. It destabilizes public trust. And in the hands of political actors seeking power, it becomes a gateway to authoritarianism. Authoritarian systems, after all, do not arise through sudden seizure. They emerge incrementally through the erosion of norms, the hollowing out of checks and balances, and the normalization of extraordinary language. We are witnessing that process in real time. As the normalization continues, the boundary between political theater and state action begins to dissolve. When legal terms like treason become part of everyday discourse and are wielded not as part of a judicial process, but as tools of public narrative, they cease to have fixed meaning. They become fluid, and fluid concepts, in political systems, are dangerous. In the Cold War era, the United States often criticized regimes that criminalized dissent under vague charges of betrayal. From the show trials of the Soviet Union, to the anti-counter-revolutionary purges in Maoist China, to the suppression of opposition in military juntas across Latin America, the American position was clear. Governments that labeled critics as traitors were operating outside the bounds of legitimacy. That principle, once projected outward, is now being tested at home. The treason accusation against former President Obama may not result in any court proceeding, but that is not its purpose. The purpose is symbolic. It is intended to erode the firewall of deference that normally surrounds former heads of state. If Obama, a figure still respected by a wide segment of the public and by many allies abroad, can be accused without consequence, then any figure can be. It is a signal that no one is safe from political retaliation. This shift does not go unnoticed by federal institutions. The judiciary, one of the few branches of government that has retained a degree of insulation from partisan politics, has increasingly become the final arbiter of disputes once settled through political consensus. But the burden placed upon it is growing heavier. Multiple federal judges, including those appointed by Trump himself, have already pushed back against efforts to politicize the legal system. In rulings, they have used unusually strong language to dismiss frivolous claims, to criticize efforts to undermine the judiciary, and to remind the public that courts are not tools of vendetta. But judicial authority relies on public confidence. And public confidence, once undermined by coordinated disinformation, becomes fragile. If enough people come to believe that courts are illegitimate, that outcomes are predetermined, and that justice is a facade, then the legitimacy of those courts, however constitutionally grounded, begins to erode. This erosion is subtle, but cumulative. It does not require any single crisis. It requires sustained pressure, sustained rhetoric, and sustained mobilization of grievance. That is precisely what the treason accusation accomplishes. In the short term, it creates media controversy. In the medium term, it justifies political escalation. In the long term, it prepares the population for a radical shift in how justice is understood. And if justice becomes subjective, if guilt is determined by party allegiance, and if institutions are expected to confirm rather than challenge political narratives, then the structure of democratic governance no longer holds. What replaces it is not necessarily dictatorship in its traditional form. It is a system in which the appearance of democracy remains, but its substance is hollowed out. Elections are held, but their legitimacy is questioned. Investigations are conducted, but their findings are dismissed. Officials serve ovation, but under constant threat of retaliation. This is the slow slide, the drift toward illiberalism that scholars of comparative politics have warned about for decades. And it does not begin with tanks in the streets, or censorship of the press, or midnight arrests. It begins with language. Language, repeated often enough, redefines expectations. It lowers thresholds. It prepares the population to accept that extraordinary measures are necessary because the threat is no longer political, but existential. When Obama is called a traitor, when others are labeled enemies of the state, the implication is that politics is no longer a matter of debate. It is a matter of survival. And if survival is the framework, then compromise becomes betrayal. This is the transformation now underway. It explains why so many of Trump's former allies have recalibrated their positions. Marco Rubio, once the author of a Senate intelligence report affirming Russian interference, now serves quietly in Trump's cabinet, saying little about the contradiction. Tulsi Gabbard, once a voice of independent criticism, now echoes Trump's most provocative claims. Others follow a similar path. These realignments are not driven by evidence. They are driven by power. Power, in its most efficient form, it does not require enforcement. It requires belief. If enough people believe that the institutions are illegitimate and that only a single leader speaks the truth, then alternative sources of authority become irrelevant. And once they are irrelevant, they can be dismantled. This is the trajectory that begins with the casual use of treason and ends with institutional collapse. It does not happen overnight. It happens incrementally, one accusation at a time. And it is happening now,